Hashtag fail. That's one of the most painful things an e-commerce company can see associated with their social media. Social media, a lot of great opportunities, but it's also rife for problems. Hi, I'm Daniel Burstein, Director of Editorial Content here at Marketing Sherpa. We're at the Marketing Sherpa Media Center at IRCE, and joining me now is Andrew Jones, an industry analyst with Altimeter Group. Thanks for joining us, Andrew.
Absolutely, nice to be here.
So let's start with talking about managing the social media team. We had a question from our audience about how to effectively manage remote workers and how to measure the performance of that social media team. So what do you recommend with that if people are looking to maybe outsource their social media?
Yeah, I mean, whether you're insourcing or outsourcing, expectations need to be set, both internally and externally. So certainly a number of brands, companies, organizations have run into challenges, especially when they do outsource some of their social media management. At first, I think a lot of brands got involved and saw it as kind of a cute toy and said, oh, let's give it to the intern, or let's give it to someone who doesn't necessarily even know that much about the company. And that can cause problems if the responses, the engagement that they end up representing your company in a very public space ends up causing problems with, as you said, social media fails or in other way misrepresenting the company. And the way to manage that, again, whether it's in-house or outsourced, is to set expectations, have a certain amount of governance and technology that can help you manage expectations and also manage what actually gets published by the team that you have working for you.
Yeah, so we'll look at a few of those examples, how to manage that in just a moment. But let's start with, what are some of the problems companies can face? We see here a few, I hate to say it, but a few epic fails, right?
Yeah, so there are a number of reasons why these fails happen. I mean, it's poor customer experience or customer service. I mean, in this case, it's kind of self-inflicted, right? Companies, in some cases, will use something like tragedy or advertising for marketing. I mean, in some cases, you're seeing real-time marketing. This is kind of this up-and-coming trend, and there's a real tremendous effect that you can actually gain value if you can take advantage of real-time marketing. But at the same time, you can really cause problems for yourself if, for example, you're trying to promote your brand by talking about the Boston Marathon tragedy, or Kenneth Cole was a good example where they tweeted about the Cairo uprising to try to get people to buy their clothing. It's really not the best way to promote your brand.
It's a tough connection to make. So let's look at a few ways that companies can avoid this. So you recommend having an actual social media policy?
Yeah, I think a lot of organizations are aware of this today, and a lot of them create social media policies, a lot of them for their associates internally. It's kind of one of the most necessary things. If you're going to be on social media, you need to have a policy that explains how the people that are engaging and representing your brand in a very public space, how they're going to be doing that.
And you also recommend publicly showing your community what your policies are. What are some leading companies doing this? What are they doing?
Yeah, this is really important because as much as you want to set expectations internally, you really need to set expectations externally for your fans and anyone who's going to see how you're engaging publicly. Because if you say something and you end up deleting comments, for example, you need to be able to point to some kind of policy that says, here's the acceptable use that we'll tolerate, anything else we'll address in some kind of way. And unless you have something to point to, it's very easy for fans or followers to get really up in arms about what you're doing or deleting or any kind of behavior. So as long as you have something to set expectations ahead of time, you really have something to fall back on and say, hey, these are the expectations that we've set.
Helps you justify what you're doing. And then it also helps have rules of engagement for when things do go wrong. There's still a lot of interns, a lot of maybe less experienced people managing this, when in the past, 20, 30 years ago, there were PR professionals that would manage these sorts of crises, right?
Yeah, that's right. And going back to your question initially about kind of outsourcing, this is a big question. I think a lot of companies have brought it in-house because they do want people who are specifically trained and understand kind of this rule of engagement to be the ones acting on a company's behalf in social media, and setting those expectations, not just the policy, but how are you going to engage in terms of transparency and triage process, who's involved and who answers to what types of issues. And for example, a crisis, you don't necessarily want an intern responding to something like that. You want probably a seasoned PR person who's going to understand, maybe even talk over with the legal team, depending on the situation, and then have an appropriate response then.
I mean, let's take a look at one of those. I'm a little hesitant to show this when we're talking about one of those crises and how it was handled because I'm flying on United tonight. But part of it is just kind of being human, right? And United seemed to ignore this problem they faced.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, even the biggest brands have run into challenges, and great brands have run into social media fails. And this was just an example where United didn't respond to an issue that was bubbling to the surface and just turned into a much bigger affair. It was they lost this 10-year-old girl. The parents happened to know a professor who was involved in the social media space. He blogged about it. It got broader attention, and a single incident like that can blow up because customers are empowered now to use these same technologies that really large brands can. And their messages, their complaints about poor customer service or experience can blow up the same way a big brand could have created a message earlier.
I think you have to understand the human element too. Like a broken guitar is probably different than a missing 10-year-old girl, right?
Yeah, but that's a great example. I mean, that United Breaks Guitars song is kind of the same thing where an individual was able to create such a huge backlash against this brand just on his own. And something like that wouldn't have been possible just a few years ago.
Yeah. Another element you talked about having those public community policies to justify decisions, but still, we don't want to just delete comments and ban people who disagree with us, right?
That's right. That's why I think it's so important to have something that sets expectations ahead of time with your community. You need to set that community policy as much as an internal policy for your associates, because if you're going to delete comments like this, you need something to point to and say, this is why we're doing this. If it's flagrantly abusive in any way, if that's something that you've said in your policy, swearing, something like that. But in this case, I mean, they didn't have any kind of policy like that they were pointing to, and in fact, this particular brand is really well known for almost like a cult-like following of these kind of expectations about how they're going to treat each other. And the biggest reason this became a big social media crisis or fail for them was because their community members called them out on basically going against their own community expectations. And you can't do that.
Yeah, well, let's end on a high note, because another thing, we want to treat all customers fairly, right? But we also have to understand who the influencers are and maybe treat them a little more fairly.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tough question. Certainly you want to identify when a crisis might occur, and understanding influencers is a part of that. But you don't necessarily, I mean, this is such a mixed bag in terms of do you give preference to an influencer or not? And a lot of brands have begun to do this. But I think most importantly, Southwest responded to an issue that became a bigger issue in a really, I think, fair way. They were very open, transparent about what was going on, and they didn't get all positive comments in terms of how they handled this, but they were very clear. They had set expectations not just for their community in terms of social media, but also how they're going to handle things in terms of their flights. And they were able to point to, this is something, we've set the expectations here, and so we were just enforcing our rules.
Sounds fair. As long as you're treating customers fairly, I guess no matter who they are,
yeah,
that's all you can really do.
Yeah, I think it's, setting those expectations is really big, and then being fair with the people, with your community, being honest with them and open, transparent, all those things go a long way to either preventing or mitigating any crisis.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us, Andrew.
Sure.
And you can watch many more videos here from the Marketing Sherpa Media Center at IRCE at marketingsherpa.com/IRCE.